Please join me in welcoming the CEO of Inerjys, Stephan Ouaknine. Stephan?
I'm going to try to talk about a model that is working in the introduction of innovations into large-scale clean energy projects. It's a very simple formula that we came up with at Inerjys. We're an investment company based in Canada. We invest globally. And the formula is, as such, global impact can only come from large scale. And large scale can only come from returns, which means a lot of people have to make a lot of money in order for an industry to truly scale. So do you remember when a telephone looked like this? Now, some people might say that it took 100 or so years to build a telephone infrastructure. But really, if you think about it, how long did it take to get to a world that we live in today where there are so many different ways to communicate through social networking and other forms of access technologies? Maybe 10, 15 years. It happened in an instant. And so why can't it happen in energy? Why do we keep saying that it takes time, longer and longer? When in reality, we're at about 6%, depending on who you speak to, of clean renewable energy in the world, and 94% of, dirty energy. So we're moving to that red line of 2 degrees and dangerously close to surpassing it unless we do something different. So what I'm advocating is a model that kind of breaks the status quo, because I'm simply saying here in Paris that the status quo isn't working. So if we look at the scale, we're clearly not at scale. So let's look at returns. Generally, the people that finance innovations tend to be venture capital type investors. But venture capitalists are running away from the clean tech sector. So while we talk about emissions targets and governments are doing their part, private sector investors are actually fleeing. So in this case, it was being called an increasingly large disaster area. In the case of CalPERS, I know there's a representative here from CalPERS, but it was called a noble way to lose money. In the case of Vantage Point, somebody talked to me about Vantage Point. It's a California VC. They were blaming their LPs, their investors, saying you can't invest in that sector anymore because you're losing too much of our money. And so clearly, we're not having returns. And if we're not having returns, we're not having scale or global impact on the problem. So why is this happening? Very simply, and I'm really sort of hyper-simplifying it for a short time frame, it's happening because the tech companies that exist in the world today, who have ways of bringing down the cost of clean energy substantially, we don't have to invent them, they exist, they are hitting a wall when it comes to commercialization. The reason that they're hitting a wall when it comes to commercialization, lack of revenues, is because the financiers of large-scale projects are risk-averse, and that's okay. They're pension funds. They have to protect the pension money. Or they're banks, and they have very strict guidelines by which to lend money. And so we have to find a different way to introduce innovations into large-scale projects. Very simple concept, and we're proving it in the market today. It's a hybrid investment strategy at Inerjys, and we're advocating that everybody should copy this model. We invest in the tech companies who have the great efficiencies to bring down the CapEx and OpEx of clean tech, of clean energy projects, but then we invest in the projects. So we're in 2 asset classes, and this is where we get unique. We're investing in projects to be the bridge of commercialization and not just hope and pray like a venture capital fund that their companies get sales. We actually make sure they get sales because we're writing the ticket. We're the ones making sure that those purchases are happening. And we're making qualified risk assessments because we're on the boards of those companies. We know when the products are ready for mainstream. So here are examples of where we're doing it. Goliath Wind is an example of an Estonian tech company who has a design for a 3.3 megawatt turbine. Now, there aren't disruptive players in the big wind market. And yet here's a company who can make a wind turbine with a completely different design, cost half the price of what the big vendors sell a large turbine for. Their innovations are in the modularity of the solution. Their innovations are in the magnet implementations. Their innovations are fundamentally in the fact that you can manufacture this wind turbine, 100% of it, locally wherever you build a wind farm. And so at Inerjys, we said, what an amazing thing. When local requirements are so important in large wind projects, like we have in Quebec, for example, where the large vendors complain about the local content requirements, and yet here's one that can be manufactured easily locally. The first prototype was built in a roller coaster factory in Budapest. So if a roller coaster factory can make a complex turbine, anybody can. So we said, let's first build wind projects, and then let's invest in the company. We're building wind projects in India, we're building wind projects in Turkey. Now that we have the commercialization piece taken care of, we're invested in the tech company. Both sides win. Let's look at tidal. GE said that tidal is going to rival wind and solar. I'm excited about that because when GE says things, everybody listens. GE Alstom. I see a friend from Alstom in the audience. And so Schottel Hydro has an incredible design that brings down the cost of CapEx and OpEx on tidal. This is a 2.5 megawatt, but it is completely modular and it scales bigger and smaller. It's good for tides. It's also good for rivers. It's a platform, it's a hub, it's a turbine, it's an incredibly modular solution. So we said, what a great investment, let's make sure there's a project. And we're the lead investor in the largest tidal project of its kind in the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia, Canada. And so we're benefiting from an interesting feed-in tariff, but fundamentally we don't need government subsidies. This is private sector driven. And in fact, the entire financing of the project was private sector, led by Inerjys, with a small bank loan, and then at the end, we're able to construct this amazing solution and replicate it into different markets. There's so many different places in the world where we can do tidal. Let's look at solar. Everybody knows that solar costs have come down. Let's look at the ecosystem around solar. And so we looked at what stands behind the panel, and we invested in a company called Solantro, which is a microprocessor that does for a solar panel what an Intel Pentium chip does for a computer and what a Qualcomm chip does for a cell phone. That is to say that it makes the solar more efficient, more powerful. And then we looked at a great company, also a Canadian company in this case, called GPL, Green Power Labs, which has smart grid. So we looked at what happens after the solar is deployed and how to use smart grid software and specifically predictive analytics and predictive controls to make a solar implementation 30% more efficient. So if you have a semiconductor behind the solar panel and smart grid on the other side, your solar is that much more profitable. Yep. And so let's look at models to deploy that. One great one, and the CEO, Francis Tourini, is here in the front row. He's a bald guy. I only invest in bald guys. Just kidding. And so this company is doing something remarkable in all markets where there is off-grid. This is off-grid solar. In Africa, there are 600 million people that are off-grid. And so this is a simple model where you take something that looks like a portable toilet and you put solar panels. The new version is actually 3 times bigger. And inside of it, you've got batteries. In the current version, there's 150 batteries in each one of them. And people line up, as we did our first deployments in Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire. People line up, and they do mobile payments with their cell phones, and they're able to take home not only the battery, so they can charge cell phones, there's USB ports, but also accessories. So they have a way to bring home lighting, LED lights, and other things to the home. This is a very scalable model where we're doing it also in Philippines and also looking to do it in India and other places where there's off-grid, which, by the way, creating synergies in the portfolio and really, really maximizing technology, we're using the Solantro chip inside of this iCabin. So we're helping to drive revenues by being invested in this company. At the end of the day, if we implement this model at scale, we are going to speed up the deployment of clean energy, and we're going to get from 6% to 20% and where we need to really be to avert disaster faster. And we need to do it faster because the status quo isn't enough. Thank you very much.
To my immediate left is Jonathan Taylor, Vice President of the European Investment Bank. And in the middle is David Hertel, who's the Minister of Sustainable Development, Environment, and Climate Change for the province of Quebec. And we're going to talk now about the role of gender diversity in clean technology. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. Good. Well, David, you're now in a position where you've got $1 billion. There's a favorite line from a former U.S. Senator, Everett Dirksen, who said you have $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking real money. And you're on your way to $3 billion in how long? In 2 or 3
2020.
Oh, 2020. So
By 2020.
Within 5 years. And you've heard some of what Stephan was talking about in terms of the kinds of at the venture capital stage. I'm wondering how you think about investments across the board, across the portfolio, from obviously big projects, infrastructure projects, to some of the earlier stage. How early stage are you going to go? How do you think? What are you allowed to do?
Well, obviously, what we're trying to do is adapt the investments to the constraints of, first of all, reducing emissions. That's the first target. Second target, you have to go and develop projects that will contribute to achieve those goals and also develop these new technologies. So for example, in Quebec, 45% of our emissions comes from the transportation sector. So obviously, the bulk of our work is going to be in the transportation sector. And what we're doing is developing projects with the private sector that will allow us to achieve substantial reductions. Now, for example, just give a real example. We invested $2 million in this Quebec company called E-Lion, which developed this entirely electric school bus. Now, a school bus, it may sound like trivial, but a school bus actually consumes 8,250 liters of diesel every year. That's 23 tons of CO2. So, and when we have 8,000 of them running in Quebec, so we've developed this, and not only have we created these jobs, but we developed this new technology. All the components were designed and developed and built in Quebec. And now the bus is running, is being tested in school boards across Quebec. And not only that, but now the company is looking to export the school bus around the world. So you have this example. We're doing the same thing thanks to the carbon market and the offset protocols, the offset credits. We've been able to have companies develop new technologies. So we have a company that developed a technology to recycle refrigerators. But again, that's a huge field. And all these companies have been able to, with the help of the Green Fund, find takers, develop the technology, and not only create jobs in Quebec, help us reduce our goals, but also export the technology.
Just to be clear, on the school bus, were they in the market with products and customers and revenue before you put money in, or were you? They were,
I would say, an old economy company.
Oh, that did converted.
And they were in the field of converting. And they had this idea of developing this electric school bus. They came to us, and we invested. We basically were the seed money. Mm-hmm. We were the venture capitalists, and we went ahead with them. And now the company is running and working.
So Stephan, how do you fit into all this? Because one of the, at least in Silicon Valley, one of the sort of maxims of venture capital is you stay away from things that have government funded or government, and that's been largely around subsidies and things like that. But how do you see? How does this affect the kinds of things that you're willing to invest in? Do the green funds, whether it's obviously in Canada but also in Europe, affect your investment decisions?
Well, we call ourselves an investment company and not a venture capital fund, and that's very deliberate. It's the way we're structured, actually. I think they overcompensated with the volume.
That's all right. You're good. You're good.
These guys are freaking me out.
Yeah.
This is a different sector. If you look at the sectors venture capitalists in California or other places did well in, the internet and telecom and other such sectors, to a degree, maybe life sciences. But this is a capital-intensive industry. This is machines. This is infrastructure. And it's not natural to the venture capital sector at all. And they'll tell you as much. And, frankly, none of them have made money in the sector.
Tesla is about the only success story still.
Yeah, but you can't hang your hat on one company. You can't, you know, these guys are all about comps. They're all about probabilities, right? They're mathematicians. They're, by the way, not operators. Most of the time, they don't know how to operate a business. They just know how to point the finger and say, you promised me revenue, there's no revenue, fire the staff, right?
So back to my question about
the question about governments is that because it's a capital-intensive sector, you have to look at, you know, public-private partnerships. So the private sector, I believe, needs to lead, but the public sector needs to set the guidelines and the regulatory framework, and in some cases, deploy money. But governments tend, you know, with the exception of the example you gave, governments tend not to want to be caught picking winners and then picking losers, basically. Right. So a good example is Barack Obama getting in trouble from the Republicans because he picked on Solyndra, and then Solyndra went bankrupt, and then the Republicans said, this is what happens when big government gets involved. So I think that what we need is leadership from the private sector, be willing to take the risk, and then governments be supportive.
Jonathan, how is the EIB working with the private sector in some of these investments?
Well, we're doing one small point to add, and I think it's very important to note that we can't use government subsidies as a crutch. We tend to rely on them because it helps us get through quarter after quarter while we're expecting some kind of future growth event that maybe doesn't happen. We use government subsidies as a crutch, and it is not a healthy practice. An industry needs to take government subsidies as a spark to stimulate an industry for growth, as we did in Quebec with the multimedia industry. The government put money into the Cité du Multimédia in Montreal, but it learned how to swim on its own and stand on its own 2 feet, and became, if you watch any 3D or animated film from Hollywood these days, it's all Québécois names, Yeah. So that's what we need. We need projects and technologies that have the margins without the subsidy. And then we need to treat the subsidy like a cherry on a sundae. It's nice to have, but we're not going to live and die by it.
Well, they're going to give us the hook well before we're ready and run out of things to talk about. But I want to ask you what your plans are on Monday morning, December 14th. Literally the Monday morning after COP, in terms of how you see what's going to be coming out of COP, what you anticipate affecting what you do. Stephan, what are you going to do Monday morning?
I'm going to go to the gym, first of all, because... But no,
I think personal sustainability comes first.
Well, I need renewable energy in order to push renewable energy.
There you go.
I think we're going to continue to, of course, bullishly invest, but be, intelligent about the risks that we take. We're going to continue to advocate that whatever targets end up being agreed to, hopefully there will be some serious targets agreed to here, and enforceable targets with penalties or whatever mechanisms to enforce them, that they are achievable. This is the message that we want to send, that the technologies to bring down the cost of clean energy, for example, or innovate on green transport and other areas, those technologies do exist. There isn't necessarily an R&D cycle of 15 years that we need to wait for, and that there are models out there to introduce those things into the marketplace and support them so that they can flourish. They will not all succeed, but enough of them will succeed that will start really making a dent in climate change.
Yeah.
Great to meet you.